The land around the river looked calm under the afternoon sun. But Luke felt the heat pressing against his back as he rode slowly toward the water. He had spent the entire morning checking fences, guiding a stubborn cow back toward his small ranch, and carrying heavy supplies from a nearby trading post. The dust from the trail coated his skin, and his shirt clung to him. Normally he would not stop at the river until sunset, but that day the heat left him exhausted. The river was the one place where the wind seemed cooler and the air felt fresh. Luke looked forward to washing the dust away more than he looked forward to dinner. He had no idea that someone else was already nearby. For him, the river was just a quiet place. For a group of Apache women who had been gathering herbs, it was the edge of their temporary path through the land. Their families often traveled during certain seasons to follow the growth of plants they needed. It was a peaceful day for them as well. They had finished filling their small woven baskets with the herbs they needed and were slowly making their way back, laughing softly to each other and talking about the things they had seen earlier. None of them expected to cross paths with anyone at that time, not a rancher, not a traveler, and especially not someone who would change their afternoon entirely. Luke reached the riverbank and tied his horse loosely to a branch. His horse lowered its head to drink, and he patted its mane gratefully. Then Luke walked toward the water, feeling relief at the idea of cooling down. He undid the buttons of his shirt and pulled it off. The breeze brushed against his skin, and he let out a relaxing breath. His arms were covered in dust and lines of dried sweat. He stepped into the shallow part of the river, took off his trousers, and leaned forward to splash cold water across his shoulders. He believed he was alone. The Apache women were no more than 20 steps away, hidden by a patch of tall shrubs. They had moved off the trail to rest briefly, and one of them bent down to pick a plant that had caught her eye. That was when she saw movement. She looked up, expecting to see an animal or maybe another woman from their group. Instead, she saw a tall, pale figure in the river. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared for several long moments, unable to understand what she was looking at. The figure lifted his arms and splashed water over himself, and the sunlight shone on his skin in a way she had never seen before. Her surprise made her stumble back into the other women. They turned toward her, confused by her sudden fright. When they followed her gaze, their eyes widened. They whispered in shock. None of them had ever seen a white man without clothes. They had seen travelers or riders at a distance, but not like this. To them, Luke's height, his broad build, and his pale skin looked nothing like the people they knew. They whispered nervously to each other, each one adding to the confusion. One woman put her hand over her mouth. Another grabbed her friend's arm. A third took a slow step back, feeling her heart race. They believed they were looking at something unusual, something not human. His size, the unfamiliar color of his skin, the way the water shined against him. They had no way to understand it through their own experiences. Their elders sometimes told stories about strange spirits that walked in odd shapes or colors, and the sight before them matched those stories more than it matched anything real. Luke, still in the river, washed his face and ran his hands through his hair. He enjoyed the cold water and the quiet around him. He felt at peace. The women watched in fear, thinking every movement he made meant something dangerous. When he reached for his trousers to pull them on, the women gasped softly and backed away so quickly that branches snapped under their feet. The sound reached Luke's ears. He froze. He lifted his head and listened. The only thing he heard at first was the wind and the river. But then he heard another snap, this time sharper. He looked around the trees, wondering if one of his cattle had wandered near. He waited, then shrugged it off. He stepped out of the water and began dressing, thinking it was probably just an animal passing by. Once fully dressed, he carried his wet shirt over his shoulder and walked back to his horse. The women, now hiding several yards farther back, watched him interact with his horse. To them, the way he handled the large animal seemed unusual too. He lifted the saddle with ease, placing it on the horse's back with a smooth motion. One woman whispered that he must be strong in ways they did not understand. Another said that he must have strange powers. Their fear grew into stories of their own, each one trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Luke mounted his horse and rode away, still unaware of how close they had been. As he disappeared down the dusty trail, the women finally let out long breaths. Their hearts still raced, and none of them spoke for a moment. Then, one by one, they began to share their thoughts. Each woman described what she thought she had seen, and the descriptions grew more dramatic with each voice. By the time they reached their camp, they had convinced themselves that the figure by the river could not possibly be a normal human man. Their return caused a stir. The elders asked why they were so shaken. Younger women gathered around them to listen. The ones who had seen Luke tried to explain the sight. They spoke fast, mixing fear with confusion. They described a pale giant in the river, a figure who washed himself with strange calmness, someone who did not look like the men they knew. Their voices rose and fell as they tried to add details they remembered or thought they remembered. Some of the elders frowned. They recalled old stories, tales passed down through generations about unusual figures who wandered the land long ago. Some stories were warnings for children, but others were meant to explain strange events in nature. As the women talked, their words seemed to fit those old stories in frightening ways. A few warriors came closer, listening with serious expressions. If something unknown was near their camp, they needed to be aware. They had families to protect. The women insisted that the figure had been large and unusual, and one said that the sight of him made her legs weak. Another said her heart pounded so hard she thought she would fall. The warriors exchanged glances, unsure what to believe but unwilling to ignore the possibility of danger. Back at his ranch, Luke wiped down his horse and poured himself some water. He felt relaxed after the bath and didn't think anything strange had happened. He went about his chores, fixing a loose board on the fence, checking his tools, and preparing supper. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't forget the sound he heard near the river. He wondered if someone had been there. Maybe travelers from another camp were using the river too. He thought it wasn't a big problem, though he did make a mental note to be more alert the next morning. The Apache women, however, didn't sleep as easily. They talked among themselves long into the evening. Some tried to calm the others by saying, maybe it was just a traveler, but others shook their heads, insisting that no normal traveler looked like that. Their uncertainty created small waves of fear in the camp, and whispers spread from one tent to another. One elder suggested that they should keep an eye on the river for a few days. If the figure returned, they would know if he was a threat. The warriors agreed to track the area. In the morning, no one wanted fear to take over their camp, but no one wanted to ignore the warning either. Luke slept peacefully that night, his windows open to let in the cool desert breeze. He did not know that a group of people nearby were now convinced he was something unusual, something they couldn't explain. He did not know that fear had caused them to imagine him as a strange creature. He had simply taken a bath at the river, never guessing that a simple moment of rest would turn into a story that grew far beyond the truth. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert once more. The Apache women woke early, still thinking about what they had seen. The warriors prepared to check the riverbank, and Luke, unaware of it all, saddled his horse and prepared for another day of work, believing that life would continue as usual. None of them knew how this small misunderstanding would pull their lives together in the days ahead. The next morning, the Apache camp woke with a quiet tension in the air. The women who had seen the strange figure at the river spoke in low voices, still unsure of what they had witnessed. Some of them had slept lightly, waking up several times during the night with the image of Luke's tall frame still in their minds. Even though they knew he had not harmed them, the shock of seeing someone so unfamiliar had lingered. The older women gathered near the fire to talk. They tried to make sense of the situation, but the more they discussed it, the more confusing it became. One woman insisted he was simply too pale to be human. Another said she had never seen anyone with shoulders that wide. A third said the way he moved in the water reminded her of old stories about unknown beings who lived near rivers. Their descriptions began to blend into one another, forming an image that was much larger and much stranger than reality. A few warriors, strong young men who respected the elders and protected the camp, listened carefully. They understood that sometimes fear made people see things differently. But they also knew that ignoring a possible threat was dangerous. So they decided to check the riverbank and look for signs of activity. If the figure was just a traveler, they would know. If it was something else, they needed to prepare. Before leaving, one warrior questioned the women again, trying to get clearer details. But each answer only added to the mystery. One woman claimed she felt the air change when the figure moved. Another said he seemed too calm, too silent, even though he was large. A third said when the light hit his skin, it looked almost unnatural, because she had never seen anyone that color up close. The warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Meanwhile, Luke also began his day. He stretched his arms as he stepped outside, enjoying the cool air before the sun fully rose. His horse nickered softly at him, and he patted its neck. He still remembered the strange sound he heard the day before at the river. Though he didn't think much of it, it stayed somewhere in his thoughts. He wondered if other travelers had started using the river again. It had been quiet for months, and sometimes travelers moved through the land without warning. Luke brushed down his horse and checked his supplies. He planned to gather a few missing cattle, but something made him pause. He thought about going to the river again to wash up. The memory of the cool water tempted him, but something told him he might not be alone next time. He chose to avoid the river for the morning, thinking he could go later in the afternoon instead. Luke trusted his instincts, even when he didn't understand why. The Apache warriors began their walk toward the river, moving carefully and watching the ground for signs. They saw fresh tracks, hoofprints, human footprints, and marks in the sand where someone had knelt. The tracks were normal enough, yet the warriors felt uneasy because of the stories they had heard the day before. Fear can make simple signs appear unusual, and that was exactly what happened. They studied the prints closely, whispering to each other. One said the footprints were too long. Another said the stride was too heavy. A third believed the marks in the sand showed an unusual shape. Their minds created details that were not truly there. At the riverbank, they found the water calm and clear. The bushes where the women had hidden the day before still showed signs of movement. Broken twigs, pressed leaves, and overlapping footprints told them that the women had been truly frightened. The warriors tried to picture what had happened there. Their worry grew as they imagined different scenarios, each one wilder than the last. Nearby, the women who had witnessed Luke returned to the river, staying behind the warriors for safety. They pointed toward the shallow area where Luke had washed. One woman said the figure had stood right there. Another said she had seen the shadow fall a certain way. All of them felt a mix of embarrassment and fear. They didn't like being afraid, but the memory had been too strong to ignore. One of the warriors knelt beside the footprints and measured them using his hand. The prints seemed larger than his own, which confirmed their worries. None of them had ever seen a man with feet that size. They didn't consider the fact that the sand might have made the prints appear bigger. The idea that Luke was unusual felt more believable to them now. They searched the area for half the morning. When they found the track of Luke's horse leading away from the river, they followed it. The hoofprints led them closer to his land. They didn't want to confront him or come too close. They only wanted to know who or what lived nearby. But as the tracks neared Luke's ranch, the warriors grew more nervous. The land around Luke's home showed signs of work, strength, and order. Wood piles were neatly stacked. The fences were well made. Tools hung on a small shed wall. Everything looked organized in a way they found intimidating. They even found large footprints near the corral. To them, it confirmed that the figure the women saw worked or lived here. They backed away slowly, not wanting to be spotted. One warrior muttered that the figure must be some kind of strong, wandering man. Another said he might be something else entirely. They whispered back and forth, unsure. At the same time, Luke was riding through a field not far away. He didn't notice them because he was focused on a calf that needed guiding back toward the herd. The warriors saw him from a distance, fully clothed and working, but because he was far off, the sunlight distorted the details of his appearance. He still looked tall and broad. His pale skin made him stand out even more under the bright sun. The warriors ducked down quickly, watching him without being seen. One warrior whispered that he moved like a man but looked too unusual. Another noted that his size seemed even bigger in the sunlight. Their fear shaped their observations, turning a normal man into something that fit the story they believed. Luke felt a strange sense of being watched again. He turned his head, scanning the distant hills, but he didn't see anything. The desert was wide, and small movements were easy to miss. He shrugged it off and continued his work, unaware that several pairs of eyes were following his every move. The Apache warriors quietly returned to their camp to report what they had seen. They told the elders that the creature, or man, was nearby. They described his size, his strength, his movements, and the tracks they had found near the river. The elders listened carefully. Some believed it was simply a rancher passing through. Others thought it matched too closely with old stories of strange figures who appeared unexpectedly. Meanwhile, the women who had seen Luke felt conflicted. They knew what they had seen, but everything was getting mixed up now. Their fear made the details harder to remember clearly. Still, the image of Luke in the river stayed strong in their minds, making their nerves rise again as the warriors spoke. By evening, the entire camp felt uneasy. The children sensed the tension among the adults and stayed close to their mothers. The elders tried to calm everyone, saying they needed to learn more before making decisions, but whispers still floated around the campfires. As the sun set, Luke finished his chores and walked toward his small wooden porch. He sat down, letting the cool evening breeze pass over him. He felt peaceful, but that faint sense of being watched still hovered in the back of his mind. He looked out toward the desert, wondering if someone had passed by. He thought it would be nice to meet neighbors someday, even if they were travelers only stopping for a short time. Little did he know, the misunderstanding between him and the Apache women was growing larger by the hour. Every word spoken in the camp turned him into someone far from who he really was. What had started as a simple, accidental moment at the river had become the center of fear and imagination. Luke sat quietly, unaware that an entire group of people were now trying to understand him while never having spoken a single word to him. The night settled in, and the stars filled the sky. The land fell quiet again, but the thoughts in the Apache camp did not rest. The misunderstanding was growing deeper, and no one knew how close they were to discovering the truth, or how one unexpected event would soon bring their lives together in a way none of them imagined. The next day began quietly, but the events that would bring Luke and the Apache group together were already forming without anyone realizing it. The morning sun lit up the desert in warm colors, and a soft breeze moved through the dry grass. Luke woke early, feeling the same unsettled sense he had felt for 2 days now, as if the land around him carried eyes he could not see. But he shook off the feeling and reminded himself that sometimes the mind created worry where none existed. He fed his horse, checked his tools, and prepared for a long ride. A few cattle had wandered east toward the rocky slopes 2 days earlier, and Luke meant to find them. He saddled his horse, tightened the straps, and set out across the open land. At the same time, not far from the rocky hills, one of the Apache women named Tayanita walked with a small bag of tools and herbs. She had gone out to gather a few special plants that grew only between certain stones. She wanted to bring them back before the sun got too strong. Her steps were careful, but she didn't expect danger. She had traveled these paths many times without trouble. The land near the rocks was quiet except for the wind brushing through the dry brush. Tayanita reached the area where a rare plant grew, bending down to pluck a few leaves. She moved gently, respecting the land the way she had been taught since she was a child. She kept her eyes on the plants, not noticing the loose stones just ahead. One wrong step changed her whole day. Her foot slipped on a round stone, and she tumbled forward, twisting her ankle painfully. She let out a sharp cry as she fell onto the dusty ground. The pain shot up her leg, and she tried to sit up, but the ankle throbbed too strongly. She pressed her hands into the ground and tried to breathe through the pain. Meanwhile, Luke was riding on a trail that curved close to the same rocky slope. He heard the faint cry echo across the rocks, and he slowed his horse, listening carefully. There was no mistake someone needed help. He turned his horse toward the sound. As he approached, he saw a figure lying on the ground. He dismounted and walked toward her slowly, not wanting to frighten her. As he stepped closer, he realized she was one of the Apache women. He had only seen them from far away before, usually moving in small groups through the land. He understood that approaching her too suddenly might scare her, so he stayed calm and gentle. Tayanita saw a tall figure coming toward her and felt a rush of fear. Her mind immediately remembered the stories they had been telling in camp. In her frightened state, she thought the figure might be the strange person they feared. But when Luke came closer, his expression was kind, not threatening. She froze, unsure what to do. Luke stopped a few steps away from her and lowered his voice. He asked if she was hurt. His tone was soft, and his face showed concern. Tayanita did not understand all his words, but she understood his calmness. It confused her even more. She expected danger, not kindness. He pointed at her ankle, tilting his head to ask if she could move it. She shook her head, gripping the ground tightly. Luke approached slowly and knelt beside her. She did not pull away, though her heart beat fast. He gently examined her ankle, careful not to cause more pain. He recognized the swelling and knew she couldn't walk without help. Luke lifted his hand slightly, signaling that he was going to move her closer to the river nearby where the ground was softer. She watched him closely, unsure if she should trust him. But when he gently slid one arm under her back and another under her knees, she felt no force or harshness. He moved with steady control, as if he wanted her to feel safe. He carried her across the dry ground toward the riverbank, each step slow and careful. Tayanita held onto his shirt without meaning to, gripping it as another wave of pain hit her ankle. Luke set her down near a smooth patch of earth. She winced but nodded to show she was all right. He hurried to the river, dipped a cloth into the cold water, and returned to place it gently on her ankle. The cold made her gasp, but she soon felt relief. He continued to cool the swollen area, working with simple skill. Tayanita watched him silently. Every movement he made was thoughtful. The image she had of him, as some strange creature, slowly faded. But the same moment held tension in another direction. The other Apache women, who had been on their way back from gathering supplies, noticed Tayanita was missing. They followed her trail and soon reached a point where they saw something from afar, Luke kneeling beside Tayanita. Their hearts jumped. They remembered their fears. They saw the pale man and started running forward, shouting her name. They believed she must be in danger. Luke heard the shouts and stood up quickly. He raised both hands to show he meant no harm. The women rushed toward them. Tayanita tried to sit up, calling out to them, but her voice was weak. The first woman to reach her dropped to her knees beside her friend, checking her quickly. Luke stepped back, giving them space. Another woman stared at him with wide eyes, not sure whether to fear him or thank him. They exchanged nervous glances. When the rest of the group arrived, including 2 warriors, the air filled with tension. The warriors moved closer protectively. Luke stayed still, hands lifted, waiting. He did not want to cause any misunderstanding. He spoke softly, explaining he only helped her because she was hurt. The warriors did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. Tayanita finally spoke clearly enough for them to hear. She told them he had helped her, not harmed her. The women paused. The warriors looked at her ankle, then at the wet cloth cooling it, then at Luke's calm posture. Slowly, their rigid stance softened. One of the women picked up the cloth from her ankle. The cold water still dripped from it. She realized he had been taking care of her. She looked at Luke again, this time with confusion instead of fear. If he were dangerous, why would he help? Luke approached slowly and pointed to Tayanita's ankle, showing them it needed lifting and supporting. The warriors hesitated, but they let him help one last time. He ripped a long strip from his own shirt and wrapped it around her ankle to support it. His hands were gentle. The Apache women watched this with growing surprise. When he finished, he stood again, taking a step back. He nodded once to show he was done helping. The warriors looked at each other, then lowered their weapons. One warrior gave a short nod in return, not quite a thank you, but not a threat either. The women worked together to help Tayanita stand, supporting her with their arms. She leaned on them, wincing but able to move. Luke watched, ready to help again, if they needed it. But they managed on their own. As the group prepared to leave, Tayanita looked back at Luke. Her expression carried gratitude and something softer understanding. She raised her hand slightly, a small gesture that meant, "Thank you," in her own way. Luke smiled faintly and nodded again. The warriors guided the women back toward their camp. As they walked, the whispers among the women changed. They no longer talked about a strange creature. They talked about a man who had helped one of their own. Their fear began to dissolve into curiosity. Luke remained by the river for a few minutes after they left. He exhaled slowly, relieved nothing had gone wrong. He hoped he had shown them he meant no harm. He washed his hands in the water, lifted his saddle, and quietly mounted his horse. As he rode home, he wondered if they would still fear him, or if this small moment changed anything. Little did he know, the story of him being a monster had begun to crumble. The truth had started to take its place, piece by piece, through a simple act of kindness. The ride back felt lighter. The desert wind brushed past him, and he let the calm wash over him. He didn't realize it yet, but his life and the lives of the Apache group had already begun to shift toward a new path, one that would soon bring them closer than either side expected. The sun rose gently over the desert the next morning, spreading warm light across the land. The Apache camp was awake early, but today, the energy felt different. The fear that had filled their hearts for days had softened. The women talked quietly among themselves as they remembered the moment when Luke helped Tayanita. Their voices carried relief instead of fear, though a little uncertainty still remained. They were not yet ready to trust fully, but the idea that Luke was a dangerous creature no longer controlled their minds. Tayanita rested near the fire with her ankle supported by herbs and cloth. The swelling had gone down slightly, and she smiled more than she had the day before. Her friends sat with her, asking her to describe again what happened when Luke found her. She repeated her story slowly, explaining how gentle he had been, how he spoke in a calm voice, and how he carried her carefully without causing more pain. Each time she told the story, the women began seeing Luke more clearly, like a human being rather than the imagined figure from their fear. The warriors also gathered together, discussing whether they should approach Luke formally or simply stay cautious from a distance. Some believed they should thank him. Others thought it was better to wait and watch, just to be sure. The elders listened quietly before speaking. They said that when someone shows kindness, it is right to acknowledge it. But they also said it should be done carefully, with respect for both sides. Meanwhile, Luke woke up at his ranch feeling thoughtful. He kept remembering the look on the Apache women's faces when they saw him helping Tayanita. He hoped they understood he meant no harm. He wondered if they would still watch him from afar, or if they might stay away from the river altogether. He felt uneasy at the thought that they might still be afraid of him. He fed his horse and checked the fence line, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the group. He realized that, even though they didn't speak much to each other, their lives were suddenly connected. He didn't know if he would ever see them again the same way, but he hoped whatever fear they once had was beginning to fade. By midday, Luke decided he would go to the river again, not to bathe, but simply to walk along the bank and check on the land. He thought if he went openly and calmly, they might know he wasn't hiding anything. He also hoped they might be nearby, so he could reassure them further. Back at the Apache camp, the elders made a decision. They told 2 warriors, along with 3 women, including Tyanita, that they should visit the river. They wanted to show respect and perhaps meet the man again to thank him properly. Tyanita could not walk fast, so 2 women helped her stand and support her weight as they moved slowly toward the river. When Luke reached the river, he walked along the edge, listening to the rustling of the wind in the bushes. He picked up a few fallen branches and tossed them aside to keep the area clear. His horse grazed nearby. Luke paused, looking at the water. The memory of Tyanita sitting on the ground with pain etched on her face flashed through his mind. He wondered if she was all right. Then, suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned quickly, but kept his posture calm. He saw the small group of Apache approaching him. The women supported Tyanita in the middle, while the warriors walked behind them, watchful but not aggressive. Luke did not move toward them immediately. He wanted to show them he respected their space. Instead, he stood still, with his hands lowered, showing an open and peaceful posture. The warriors watched his hands closely, remembering how he had raised them the day before to show he meant no harm. Tyanita was the one who stepped forward first. Her limp was noticeable, but her expression carried quiet strength. She looked at Luke with a calm face. The women supporting her spoke softly in their language, encouraging her. Luke nodded kindly. He pointed toward her ankle, silently asking if she was feeling better. She smiled lightly and nodded back. Even though neither of them understood each other's words clearly, the gestures spoke loudly. One of the warriors stepped forward and placed a hand on his chest, then pointed toward Luke. It was a gesture of respect. Luke understood it meant thank you or appreciation. He returned the gesture with a nod. Another woman stepped forward with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She held it out carefully. Luke hesitated at first, not wanting to take something that was meant for their own families. But when the woman insisted gently, he accepted it with gratitude. Inside the bundle were dried herbs, a gesture of thanks from their culture. The moment felt peaceful, and the earlier fear that had once stood between them seemed to melt away. Luke spoke softly, even though he knew they might not understand his words. He told them he was glad Tyanita was all right, and he told them he did not wish to frighten anyone. His tone carried sincerity, and the group understood enough. Tyanita raised her hand slightly, repeating the small gesture of thanks she had made the day before. Luke smiled warmly. The warriors exchanged glances and relaxed their shoulders. The women's nervous expressions softened. The group stayed there with him for several minutes. They pointed at the river, at the plants nearby, and at the land around them as if showing him the areas they used. Luke listened, nodding and smiling, even though he only understood parts of what they meant. He pointed toward the hills and his ranch, showing them he lived not far away. There was no tension now, only quiet communication built on respect. One of the warriors bent down to check Tyanita's ankle again. Luke watched and then pointed toward the river, showing that the cold water could help reduce the swelling. The warrior nodded thoughtfully. The women lifted Tyanita slightly and helped her sit on a soft patch of ground. Luke brought a clean cloth from his saddlebag, dipped it in the river, and handed it to the women. They accepted it gratefully. As they rested, the conversation grew lighter. The women pointed at the sky, speaking softly about the weather changing. Luke looked up as well, trying to understand. One woman pointed at Luke's horse and smiled gently. Luke responded by gently patting the horse's neck, showing it was friendly. Slowly, The group began to see him not as danger, not as mystery, but simply as Luke, a young cowboy living his life on the land just as they lived theirs. Eventually, the time came for the Apache group to return to camp. Tayanita stood with the help of her friends. Luke backed away, respectfully, not wanting to intrude. As they began walking, Tayanita looked back once more. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended her hand outward, a sign of deep gratitude in her culture. Luke felt touched and returned the same gesture in his own simple way, pressing his hand gently against his chest. As the group disappeared over the hill, Luke exhaled slowly. The tension he once felt in the air was gone. He felt peaceful, knowing the misunderstanding had dissolved completely. He hoped that the next time they met, it would be with open calmness, not fear. The Apache camp welcomed the returning group with curious eyes. When they heard what had happened, how Luke had shown kindness again, how he accepted their thanks respectfully, and how Tayanita felt safe around him, the camp's worry softened even more. The elders smiled gently, saying that sometimes the land brings strangers together to teach understanding. Over the next few days, the relationship between Luke and the Apache group became unexpectedly warm. When he rode past their camp, the women waved gently instead of hiding. The children peeked out without fear. The warriors nodded in greeting. The elders recognized him and lifted a hand in quiet peace. Luke felt lighter every time he passed their land. He stopped at the river often, and sometimes he found the women gathering herbs. They did not run or hide anymore. Instead, they smiled shyly or greeted him with small hand gestures. He responded the same way. What had started as a shocking misunderstanding began to grow into a story of trust. The Apache women no longer believed he was a monster. They now knew he was a man, gentle, calm, and helpful. And Luke found himself respecting them deeply in return. Their strength, their traditions, and their dignity impressed him. He no longer felt watched by fearful eyes. Instead, he felt seen with understanding. A single moment at the river had once sparked fear. Now, through honesty, patience, and kindness, it had turned into something better. An unexpected friendship that brought peace between two worlds that once stood apart.